Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi everyone and welcome to the seminar today. Today we are so lucky to hear from Dr. Julia Yesberg, who is a lecturer in forensic psychology at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Julia has previously held postdoctoral positions at the Jill Dando Institute for Security and Crime Science at University College London and the Institute for Social Justice and Crime at the University of Suffolk. Her current research interest explores two areas, the interactions between criminal justice practitioners and individuals in the criminal justice system, focusing on procedural justice, social identity, trust and legitimacy, and secondly, public attitudes towards people who have offended. So for the seminar, I'm going to hand over to Julia to give her talk. During the seminar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat or use the Q&A function, and there will be time for questions at the end where I'll read those questions out. So without further ado, over to you, Julia.
Hey, kia ora tātou. Thank you, April, for inviting me and for the introduction, and thank you to everybody for being here this afternoon. So I was going to start by telling you a bit about my background. April has already done a bit of that, but I'll also tell you where the research that I'm going to be presenting today was carried out. So I'm currently a lecturer in forensic psychology at Te Herenga Waka, but this isn't the first time that I've been here. So I actually did my PhD at Victoria University, supervised by Devin Palaschek. And my research at that time was focused on rehabilitation, reintegration, and risk assessment. I then spent 8 years in the UK, and my first job was at the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. And this is an organisation that enacts the Mayor of London's Policing and Crime Plan, and also has oversight of the Metropolitan Police. So it was here that I kind of first started getting into the area of policing. I then had the opportunity to do a secondment to the Centre for Global City Policing, which is based in the Jill Dando Institute of Security and Crime Science at UCL. And while I was there, I applied for an Economic and Social Research Council early career grant, and that was focused on neighbourhood policing. So I ended up spending about 5 years at UCL, and that's where the research I'm going to present today took place. So my talk today is focused on understanding public cooperation with the police. And to do this, I'm going to draw on procedural justice theory. So the data itself comes from a longitudinal panel survey that we actually conducted during the first wave of the pandemic. And at that time, when we decided to conduct this survey, we were really interested in understanding people's support for giving police kind of enhanced powers to deal with the social distancing regulations, and to track this support over time. But we also measured lots of other variables related to people's more general perceptions of the police. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this talk. So why do we care about public cooperation with the police? So we know that social control mechanisms are really important for maintaining order and preventing crime. And we also know that most social control occurs informally. So social norms, community values and expectations typically govern acceptable behaviour within a community and produce social order without the need for the police. So when informal social control in a community is strong, people know one another, neighbours watch out for each other, and they expect others to do the same. So there's a sort of collective sense of responsibility. But when these more informal mechanisms fail, formal social control becomes necessary for maintaining order, and that's where the police come in. However, the police rely on the public's cooperation to help them maintain order. So they need people to report crime, to tell them where problems are occurring, and to give them intelligence to help solve crimes. So it's really important to understand the kinds of things that influence whether people are willing or not to cooperate with the police. So procedural justice theory is the leading explanation for why people cooperate with the police. And the theory was originally developed with the legal system to understand how processes used in courts influence defendants' perceptions of fairness and justice. And it's been applied extensively to other areas of the justice system. So procedural justice theory suggests that people are more likely to accept an outcome, even one they disagree with, if they believe the process leading to that outcome was fair. And there are four main aspects to procedural justice. The first is voice, so whether people feel they were given the opportunity to express their opinions and perspectives during the process. The second is neutrality, so whether people think that the person making the decision was neutral and transparent. The third is respect, so whether people feel they were treated with dignity and respect during the decision-making process. And the fourth aspect is trustworthiness. So whether people think that the person making the decision was sincere and had trustworthy motives. So when people experience procedural justice, they feel more positively about the outcome. So the process by which decisions are made is really important to people, even more so than what the outcome is. So within policing, procedural justice reflects the fairness of the processes through which the police make decisions and exercise authority. So police officers embody procedural justice when they're respectful of members of the public, when they're neutral in their decision-making, when they portray trustworthy motives, and when they provide people the opportunity to voice concerns before they make a decision. And lots of research has shown that procedural justice is associated with a greater willingness to follow police directives. So when people perceive the police to be procedurally just, they're more likely to cooperate with them. And research also shows that procedural justice is more important to people than instrumental concerns. For example, whether the police are perceived to be effective at fighting crime. So people place a greater emphasis on the fairness with which the police treat people than on whether they think they're doing a good job at maintaining order or dealing with crime. So the link between procedural justice and cooperation is pretty well established, but why is this? What is it about people's experiences or perceptions of procedural justice that leads to a greater willingness to cooperate? So according to procedural justice theory, there are two mechanisms at play. The first is social identity, and the explanation for this mechanism draws a lot on social psychology and the psychology behind group membership. So it's thought that the experience of procedural justice communicates to people that they have status and value within the social groups the police are thought to represent. And these social groups are usually defined as the nation or state or this kind of notion of a law-abiding citizen. So police are often referred to as prototypical representatives of these broader social groups. So the idea is that procedural justice strengthens people's identification with these broader social groups, and by extension strengthens people's identification with the police. So it makes people feel like the police are more like them and that they're part of the same social group. So being treated fairly and respectfully strengthens people's social bonds with the police, and these social bonds in turn influence people's willingness to cooperate. The second mechanism is police legitimacy. So it's thought that procedural justice signals to people that police authority is legitimate and should be obeyed. So research has shown that when people are treated with procedural justice, they're more likely to recognize the police as a legitimate authority. Police legitimacy, in turn, has been shown to enhance cooperation. So people are more likely to cooperate with authority figures who they view as legitimate. So legitimacy has been operationalized in a variety of different ways in the literature, but there are generally thought to be two aspects to legitimacy. The first is a duty to obey, so whether people feel morally and legally obligated to obey the police. And the second is normative alignment, so whether people think police practices are aligned with their own values and norms. So procedural justice enhances legitimacy, and legitimacy enhances cooperation. So procedural justice theory suggests that social identity and legitimacy mechanisms work together to promote a willingness to cooperate with the police. However, the two mechanisms have typically been looked at separately in previous research. So we don't know much about whether social identity or legitimacy is the more important mechanism or what the relationship is between them. So in the analysis that I'm going to present today, we look at both of these mechanisms at the same time, so we can kind of determine the unique contribution of each of them. And we also consider not just perceptions of formal social control, so what people think about the police, but the role of informal social control in enhancing cooperation. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, communities engage in informal social control when members regulate each other's behaviour through social norms, values, and expectations, rather than through formal rules or the police. So, for example, when neighbours communicate with each other about suspicious activities in the area, or when they encourage each other to be safe and secure, or when they address minor issues in their community. So informal social control refers to these small, everyday actions that regulate behaviour within a community. And informal social control is very effective in reducing dependency on formal social control. So when communities self-regulate, many issues get addressed before they escalate to a level that requires the intervention of police. Research also shows that communities with strong informal norms are more likely to cooperate with the police when needed. So, for example, if there's a strong norm of reporting issues within the community, it becomes much more likely that residents will then call the police when they see something out of the ordinary. On the other hand, when communities have weak norms about the regulation of behaviour, they may feel that calling the police is not a normative thing to do and may be less likely to do so. So bringing everything together, this is the conceptual map that's going to guide the analysis that I'm going to present. So our overarching research question is what factors influence people's willingness to cooperate with the police? And we hypothesize there'll be two significant pathways. The first will be an indirect pathway from procedural justice to cooperation through social identity and legitimacy. So we expect that procedural justice will be associated with social identity, that social identity will be associated with legitimacy, and that legitimacy will be associated with cooperation. We also expect that social identity will have a direct effect on cooperation, independent of the effect of legitimacy. So they'll each be adding something unique. And the second pathway will be a direct one between informal social control and cooperation. So people who live in neighbourhoods with strong informal social norms will be more likely to cooperate with the police. So the data for the study comes from a 5-wave longitudinal panel survey that we conducted during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. So data were collected online via Prolific Academic, which is an online platform where researchers can recruit participants. And we surveyed 1,200 participants residing in 10 metropolitan areas across the UK. So we had about 300 people from London and then 100 each from a variety of other cities. So Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds, Birmingham, Cardiff, and a few others. So as I mentioned earlier, when we did the survey, we were kind of really interested in stuff that was quite specific to the pandemic and about how whether people were willing to support giving the police more powers. But we also measured the key concepts within procedural justice theory. So procedural justice, identity, legitimacy, cooperation. And most procedural justice research has been done with cross-sectional surveys. However, the conceptual map that I just presented suggests that there is some sort of temporal ordering where procedural justice leads to social identity, to legitimacy, and then to cooperation. So our data gives us the opportunity to look at these relationships longitudinally. So today I'm going to be presenting data from the first 4 waves of the survey, which were conducted about 3 weeks apart between April and June 2020. So these are our sample characteristics. So our retention rates were pretty high across the 4 waves. This is probably due to the fact that we were in lockdown at this time, and so people probably had a bit more time on their hands to take part in research. And in total, we had 890 people who completed all of the first 4 waves, which is about 74% of the initial sample. So almost 2/3 of the sample were female, and the majority were under the age of 44. 85% were white, and 80% were born in the UK. So compared to the general population in the UK, our sample was reasonably representative in terms of ethnicity, but over-representative of females and younger adults. And these differences are likely a function of our method of recruitment. So Prolific's participant pool includes more females and younger adults. But we control for all of these sample characteristics in our analyses. Okay, so all the things that we are interested in were measured with multiple items, and we used confirmatory factor analysis to generate the variables for analysis. So procedural justice was measured at wave 1, including items such as how often do you think the police in your neighbourhood treat people with respect? Informal social control was also measured at wave 1. For example, if I sense trouble in this area, I could get help from people who live here. Social identity was measured at wave 2, and we had 3 different measures of social identity. So the first 2 represent broader social groups that the police are thought to embody. So British identity, how important is being British to how you see yourself, and citizen identity, how important is being a law-abiding citizen to how you see yourself. And we also have a third measure of identity, which is identification with the police as their own social category. So I identify with the police as one of the items. Legitimacy was measured at wave 3, and we included the 2 different aspects of legitimacy that I mentioned earlier. So we had duty to obey, to what extent is it your moral duty to obey the police, and we had normative alignment. So I support the way the police usually act. And cooperation was our ultimate outcome variable, which was measured at wave 4. So if the situation arose, how likely would you be to call the police to report a crime you witnessed? So this is the full model, which includes the different measures of social identity and legitimacy. So we want to know whether social identity and legitimacy are explaining the relationship between procedural justice and cooperation, and which of these is more important. And we also want to know the effect of informal social control on cooperation, controlling for the procedural justice pathway. So before we tested our model, we looked at the correlations between the key constructs. And we can see the bottom row that cooperation is significantly and positively correlated with all 7 explanatory variables. And the strongest correlations are with police identity and normative alignment. In addition, we can see that procedural justice is significantly correlated with all 3 identity measures and both aspects of legitimacy. So procedural justice is related to our hypothesized mediators. So this means that we can move on to the full model. Okay, so we conducted a full structural equation model in R, and variables measured in each successive wave were regressed on all variables from previous waves. And as I mentioned earlier, all sample characteristics were controlled for in the analysis. So if we start from the left-hand side of the figure, as expected, we see that procedural justice is significantly associated with all 3 identity measures, with the path between procedural justice and police identity showing the largest effect. So people who think the police are procedurally just are more likely to identify with them. Next, all three identity measures are significantly associated with both aspects of legitimacy. So people who identify with the police and its social groups are more likely to view them as legitimate. Next, normative alignment is significantly associated with cooperation, but duty to obey is not. So the belief that police are aligned with their own values seems to be more important for predicting cooperation than the belief that the police must be obeyed. We also had direct effects of procedural justice on both legitimacy measures, and two of the identity measures had direct effects on cooperation. So part of the effect of social identity on cooperation went through normative alignment, and part of it was direct. So the total indirect effect from procedural justice to cooperation through our mediators was significant, and we found several significant indirect pathways from procedural justice to cooperation. The most important it's not showing up my animations, they're meant to light up. So the most important ran through normative alignment and through police identity. And lastly, we look at the contribution of informal social control. And we can see that controlling for procedural justice, social identity, and legitimacy, informal social control has a significant direct effect on cooperation. So people's perceptions of whether there are strong informal norms within their community predicts people's willingness to cooperate with the police. Okay, so just to summarize the findings, we found that procedural justice influences people's willingness to cooperate with the police by enhancing social bonds and increasing police legitimacy. So when people perceive the police to treat them fairly and respectfully, they're more likely to identify with the police. Identifying with the police, in turn, increases police legitimacy and ultimately increases people's willingness to cooperate with the police. We found that both social identity and legitimacy are important mediators, and that the largest indirect effects are through police identity and normative alignment. So shared identity, values, and norms seems to be particularly important for generating cooperation. And lastly, we found that people's perceptions of informal social control in their community influence their willingness to cooperate with the police. So when there were strong community norms, people were more likely to cooperate. So alongside perceptions of formal social control, informal social control also seems to be relevant and is adding something unique. Excuse me. So just some take-home messages. Consistent with what we find in other areas of the justice system, people care about the process and not just the end result. So people want to be treated fairly and respectfully and to be given a voice. And people often care more about the way in which they're treated than the actual outcome. So fair processes can impact people's willingness to cooperate and comply. So it's not just that treating people fairly is the right thing to do, but it has these important knock-on effects for generating voluntary cooperation and compliance. And we saw in our model that cooperation seems to be based on shared values and identity, as opposed to a duty or obligation to obey. So people cooperate with police primarily because they believe the police uphold values aligned with their own, and not out of a mere sense of obligation. And this has really important implications for policing practices. So fair treatment, impartiality, upholding social norms and values are some of the things that are going to have the biggest effects on public trust and cooperation. So police forces should really make them a priority and make sure that officers are equipped to engage with the public in this way. And lastly, we found that informal social control complements formal social control. So communities with strong social norms tend to cooperate more with the police than communities with weak social norms. So understanding how we can encourage communities to self-regulate is an important avenue for future research. Okay, I thought I'd just briefly consider the implications of this research on policing in Aotearoa. So I haven't done any research in this area here yet, but I have been thinking about the relevance of procedural justice theory to a bicultural context. So previous research has typically assumed that the police represent a social group that people feel connected with. So the police and the public are assumed to share the same social group. But we know that some people may not feel connected with groups the police represent, and instead they may feel more strongly aligned with their own ethnic or cultural group. So there's been some research with Muslim communities in Australia, which has found that for individuals who feel highly stigmatized, procedural justice is actually more important to them than for people who feel less stigmatized. So the way police interact with people who don't feel connected with the dominant social group may be even more important. I've also been thinking about whether other factors are important in Aotearoa. So, for example, for Māori, cultural competency might be just as, if not more important than procedural justice. So I think it'll be really interesting to explore the different kind of values and expectations people have in terms of how the police interact with them. I've also been thinking a little bit about the implications of this research for current issues in policing in Aotearoa at the moment. And the obvious one is the expanded powers in relation to policing gangs and the wearing of gang patches. So we've done quite a bit of research in the UK looking at support for expanded police powers. So we've looked at support for providing the police more weapons, for police use of live facial recognition, and support during the pandemic for enhanced powers to regulate, to enforce the social distancing guidelines. And we found that similar things seem to be important. So procedural justice and legitimacy seem to also be important when thinking about whether or not to support granting the police more power. So yeah, this is just like initial thoughts, and I'm really interested to connect with people who might be interested in this kind of research or have some ideas on how we could apply some of this stuff to policing in New Zealand. So this is my email address. Please feel free to reach out if you want to have a chat. And I also welcome any questions now. So thank you very much for listening.